Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Matthew Monagle, and I'm the web manager here at Columbia Business School Executive Education. And we're going to be hearing a talk today on why authenticity is the secret ingredient of leadership with Professor Paul Ingram. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping tips. We will have about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for Q&A, so we would encourage you to go ahead and submit your questions as they come to mind throughout the webinar. We'll circle back to them at the very end, and if you think of something, we don't want to lose it, so be sure you ask it right away. Also, we will have a full recording of this webinar available, usually within 2 to 3 business days of the event. We typically send those out via email as well, so if you're on this mailing list, keep an eye out. We'll notify you when the recording is ready. And finally, if you're following along and if you're someone who uses social media, we'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, the things that came to mind as the presentation continued. Use the CBS ExecEd hashtag, that's hashtag CBS ExecEd, and we'll make sure to find those. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Paul Ingram. Professor, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. So I'd like to talk about some research that I'm doing with two partners. Sheena Iyengar, who's a professor at the Columbia Business School. She's the author of the great book, The Art of Choice, and Yoonjin Choi, who's an outstanding PhD student at the school. The heart of this research is really taking something very concrete. It's a tool, and using it to achieve something which is very important, although rather abstract, which is authenticity. I'd like to start in the concreteness of the tool. And I'd like to do that by giving you an introduction to the tool, the mechanism that we use to help leaders trigger their own authenticity. And we'll introduce that by giving you a reflection that we actually use at the beginning of the process that creates this tool for leaders. So if you like, get a piece of paper, a pen or pencil. You might make a few notes in the process of this. I'm going to ask you to do a reflection. Think about a time, a recent time at work that for you was fabulous, a great moment at work, an ideal situation, something that in your own evaluation was really wonderful. Take a moment to savor the visceral experience of being in that situation. Put yourself back into the feelings of that moment. And now I'm going to ask you to try as concisely as you can to zero in on just what it was that was present in that situation that for you explains why it was so ideal. Use one word if you can. It might be a word like excitement or learning or teamwork or achievement. You choose the word, but be as concise as you can. I'll give you a moment to think about that reflection. So if you have a word, see if you could add a second word to it. It doesn't have to be related to the first one, but something else that was present in that situation that, according to your own evaluation, explains why it was so wonderful. And if you have a second word, you might try and add yet a third one. So now, hopefully, you have 2 or 3 words written on a piece of scrap paper. Those words, based on my experience, I would predict are values. They might actually be some of the 250 values that we've had when we've done this exercise with some thousands of MBA students and executives. So I'm going to describe for you the steps that we follow up on that introductory reflection when we are creating the tool that we're is going to be the basis of the research I described. So we begin the process with the reflection that you did and some other reflections. The reflections lead the participant to think about things that are really important to him or her. Values are actually ideals. And we use reflections on great moments, terrible moments, important situations to help the leader kind of feel out her ideal space, her value space. And then when the leader has a kind of set of feelings around her values, we have a second step in our process that helps zero in and actually distinguish 8 most important values. And we do that by presenting the leader with choices, with opportunities for comparing 2 values with each other. And we do that in a number of different ways. One of them is that we create markets for values where the participants go around the room and they trade values with other people who are in a group. That's just one of the mechanisms we use. But the output of that second step in our process is the leader is left with 8 values, which for her are the perfect expression of her ideals. And then we have a third and final step in the process where we go from these 8 values to think about concrete connections between those values. And the way we do that is we ask the leader to identify interdependencies such that satisfying one value helps lead to the satisfaction of another. So for example, in this real example I have on the slide, this leader is saying that pursuing the value of hard work helps her to make things better, which leads to the satisfaction of fulfillment that for her is a route to her peak value, which is good. Nothing unusual about this hierarchy. 8 values connected into an interdependent system as the leader sees fit. I've got other examples. I've chosen these almost at random just to show you the kind of realistic variance that we see when we do this exercise. So this product we call a values hierarchy. And actually now we've gone through the process I described with some thousands of executive MBA students and participants in executive education programs to produce these value hierarchies. So why that effort? Why are we producing these value hierarchies with our students and participants? Well, let me go back to my opening encounters with the concept of values to explain that. So I became interested in values about 10 years ago. I received an assignment to serve as the faculty director of Columbia's Advanced Management Program. That's a 4-week residential program on leadership and strategy for senior executives from around the world. And when I took the assignment to direct that program, I set out to understand the components of the program. And there was a part of the program that had been there for years. It was called values coaching. And there was an excellent coach who developed a one-on-one coaching process. He would sit down with a leader for an hour, and the result would be one of these value hierarchies. Now, at the time, I didn't know why that was an important thing. I had no concept of how a value hierarchy could help a leader. But something was obvious from the very beginning, that for many of the leaders that went through the process of creating the hierarchies, they were really precious products. Just one example, we had a participant in the program who finished, went back to work, and shortly after was appointed as CEO of his global company. He was interviewed by the Financial Times, and the reporter said, "What did you learn in your month at retreat at Columbia?" And he actually pulled from his wallet the laminated card that he had received that captured his own values hierarchy. And he said, "I created this at Columbia, and this was this incredible tool that helps me as a leader." So that enthusiasm from the people who created the values hierarchies cued my own enthusiasm as a teacher and a researcher. And I set about a way to scale the process of creating these hierarchies, both so we could take them to many more people and that we could do research on them. And subsequently, as I say, we've created these hierarchies with some thousands of executives and MBA students, people from around the world. So why does it matter? What does it all add up to? Well, our research has shown that the hierarchies can explain a number of outcomes: ethical decisions, effective and satisfying decisions, fit in an organizational culture, the robustness and establishment of relationships. But we're here to talk about authenticity. So let me ask you to do another reflection. Think about the people in your own life who you would consider as being authentic. Again, you could note a few names on a piece of paper. And when you've identified a few people, ask yourself this: what is it about them that leads you to view them as authentic? How do you explain their authenticity? Now, if you're like the others I've asked those questions of, the first question is easier to answer than the second. I find that leaders actually have a kind of natural attraction to the concept of authenticity. They almost by consensus view it as important, maybe necessary for effective leadership. But at the same time, they view it as very important. It's also ambiguous and hard to define. It seems to be one of those things that you know it when you see it, but you can't completely specify. So I've been very interested by that tension between something which is important but kind of elusive, and that's motivated the research that I'm going to talk to you about now. One of the ways I've pursued my interest in the topic is I simply asked practicing leaders, how do they define authenticity? And I've heard a lot of vague responses to that question, but I've also heard some which were informative. And I think my favorite response, perhaps because it encapsulates so many of the others, comes from a leader who suggested that authenticity occurs when a leader's values are aligned with her behaviors. Values aligned to behaviors. Now let's take that definition for a moment. Let's, for the moment, take that as truth, that that's what authenticity is. So if so, then what does it take for an observer, say a potential follower of the leader, to evaluate a leader's authenticity? Well, the observer would need two inputs. The observer would need a perception of that leader's behaviors and a perception of that leader's values, and then they would have to evaluate the alignment between the two. So one of those inputs, the perception of the behaviors, is actually very accessible. The observer could watch the leader and observe the behaviors directly, or the observer could ask other people how the leader behaves. But you can learn how somebody behaves. But the other necessary input, a window into the leader's values, is actually much less accessible. Values are actually deep within us, and they can be hard to express in a clear way, even when we try to express them. Right? So what that discussion is suggesting is that maybe what's hard about evaluating authenticity is accessing this hidden input, which is values. That's really the motivation for the research I'm going to talk to you about. We're working off the idea that by helping leaders access their values, we can help them feel more authentic, be perceived by others as more authentic, and therefore be more effective leaders. Let me tell you about two of the studies that we've done in this direction. Now, both of these studies are using subjects who are from Columbia's outstanding set of executive MBA students. So these are working professionals. They average around 32 or 33 years. They have experience as leaders. They're working in a big set of industries. And early on in their MBA program, they developed these value hierarchies that I described to you. So in the first study, we're going to look at the effect of access to one's values hierarchy, which we actually call values affirmation, for feeling authentic. So the study worked this way. We took a group of executive MBA students, and for a random half of them, we asked them to do a reflection. We presented them with their own values hierarchy, and we said, think it over, look at it, think about what these values mean to you. And then for the other half, we gave them another 5-minute reflection that had nothing to do with values. We asked them to reflect on an everyday experience. And then we asked everybody if they felt authentic. And the results indicate, indeed, that people who were values affirmed, who had reflected on their own values, subsequently felt much more authentic than the people who didn't. Similarly, they also said that they feel more like themselves and more like their ideal self. So this is the first connection in the process of achieving authenticity that we're trying to document. Why does it occur? Well, we actually think that what's important about the values hierarchies is that they represent ideals. Values are ideals. And if you think about your own personal values, it's an opportunity to cue yourself and to connect to your ideal self. And we think that that's what helps people to feel more authentic. Now let me go on and explain how we go from this values to feeling authentic to actually being perceived as more authentic by others. So we have a second study with the same types of executive MBA students as participants. Now in this study, we asked them to do something which they do, with some regularity, given that they're already leaders, which was to prepare and offer a leadership communication to people they were leading. So we put them in a situation and we said, you've just been appointed as head of a new team. You're about to meet the people you're leading. Give them a short speech explaining what you stand for as a leader and how the team is going to be successful. Gave them 45 minutes to prepare that speech, and we videotaped the speeches in a standardized way, and then we analyzed the speeches to see if we could find features which were associated with authenticity. Now, there was also an experiment involved. So for a random half of these students, we asked them when they were preparing their speeches to think and consult their own values hierarchy. We said you could use it any way you like. You don't have to refer to it in your speech, but have it in mind when you prepare your leadership message. So the structure is something like this. We've got these two groups, one that prepared their speech with reference to their values and the other that didn't. And they're taping the speech, and then we're evaluating the speech to see if we can find significant outcomes. Now, the most important difference that we're looking for is to see if third-party observers would view the speeches of the people who were consulting their values as being more authentic. The third parties were people from the same professional world as the speakers. They weren't people who knew the speaker, but they were from the same industries and types of jobs. So they were in a good position to evaluate the effectiveness of the leader. So the key test is, does values affirmation result in a leadership effort, a communication that is viewed by others as being more authentic? And in fact, it does. The half of the students who prepared their speech with an eye to their own values were viewed by third parties, who of course didn't know anything about the experiment, as being more authentic. And we also learned in this study that the values affirmed leaders who were viewed as more authentic were also trusted more by those third-party observers. So now we go from authenticity to leadership effectiveness, because of course, trust in a leader is a big input for lots of positive things, both for the follower and for the collective effort. So given that the speeches of these value-affirmed leaders were viewed as more authentic, of course, our next question was why? How were they different? And we dug into that question in a couple of ways. The first thing we did is we showed the videos to professional communications coaches. These are experts in communication. And the communication coaches analyzed the speeches for two sets of factors. The first was the quality of the message, the opening and the ending, the use of humor and the use of stories. How is the message structured? And the second thing the coaches looked for was the nonverbal communication, eye contact, hand gestures, and other things that they view as part of effective nonverbals. Now, fascinating, these professional coaches could not find a difference in their technical measures of the communications quality between the values group and the non-values group. As far as they were concerned, the speeches were the same technically, but yet we saw that third-party peers viewed one group as being more authentic than the other. So, to try and learn more about why, we dug into the content of the speeches. We did actually text analysis of the words and concepts that were used in the speeches. Now, here we found some differences. People in the values condition were less likely to use words that represented anxiety or fear. We think the reason for this is that when you cue into your own values, connect to your ideal self, it has a calming effect and makes it less likely you'll use those anxious words. Also, people who prepared the speech with an eye to their values used more words that revealed their cognitive processes, things like think and consider. They offered less commands, less should, must, or ought to the people they were leading. And they were less likely to reference themselves in the speech using I and me. Now, this last result is really fascinating to us because there's a new idea in the academic literature on leadership that is actually critical of leadership views that suggest that the leader should tune into themselves, whether their own values or some other internal reflection, as a mechanism for being effective as an external leader. Those criticisms say that, look, if you look inside yourself, that's a selfish exercise. It's sort of narcissistic. And leadership is social. You shouldn't be thinking about yourself. You should be thinking about the people you're leading. Well, our result is going against that criticism. We're actually finding that the leaders who start by looking inside themselves and reflecting on their values are actually less selfish in their communication speech. So we have found some differences between the speeches of the values group and the group we're comparing them to. But also fascinating to us as researchers, those differences don't fully explain why reflecting on your values leads to more authenticity. They tell a little bit of the story, but not the whole story. So far in our analysis, we're in this really compelling position where we have a concrete mechanism to create the perception of this thing that many leaders are pursuing, which is authenticity, but we cannot put our fingers exactly on what the leaders who are more authentic are actually doing. Now, the truth of the matter is, I expect that really what it is a somewhat complex combination of different types of words and maybe even different elements of the technical communication. And at some point, I imagine either our research team or someone else is going to pinpoint exactly what the values affirmed leaders do that lead them to be viewed as more authentic. For now, we're using the concept of an aura to describe it, rather romantic as opposed to scientific. But I like the idea that leaders who tap into their values have this kind of glow, which others pick up on and leads to more effectiveness. So let me summarize where we've been. We started by talking about values and our values hierarchy exercise. We use this as a mechanism to help leaders tap into their ideal selves. When they do that, they feel more authentic. Also, when they do that, they are perceived by others who watch them lead as being more authentic, and those others trust them more, and that leads to leadership effectiveness. My goal here really is to whet your appetite for thinking about values as a tool for concrete benefits. In this case, the precious but elusive attribute of effective leaders, authenticity. Now I'd love to hear some questions.
Great. Paul, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try and get to them. But the first one is actually one that I can handle. We've had a few people ask about the slides and about the presentation. We are definitely going to have a full recording of this available. We usually have those in about 3 to 5 business days. We don't distribute the slides. If you want those, you'll have to come to Paul's class. But they will be available as part of the recording as well. So you can go back and revisit, replay some of the sections that seemed relevant. Now, we do have a lot of questions that have been coming in. And the first one that I wanted to get to, which I thought was interesting, was from Suzanne, who asked about kind of the cross-cultural differences as well.
Yeah.
If you're communicating with people, or if you're a large organization that has different offices in different parts of the world, how can you kind of account for those cultural differences when you're working to be authentic and to be a leader?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And we have been looking a little bit at the relationship between national culture and values. And there is a relationship. We do find not major differences, but we find some differences in the values expressed by people who are in different nations. The key, I would say, for using what we're talking about now to lead across cultures is that the importance of the values is not actually expressing particular values that are appealing to the people that you lead. Instead, we think what values help the leader do is tap into her ideal self. And we have so far found that that is appealing to observers, call them followers, from different demographic characteristics, national organizations, national cultures, which show up a little bit in our data. So I would say so far, based on what we know, that values are something that make the leader better, and it's perceived across different cultures that we like people who are tapping into their ideal selves, even if their ideal self is different than what our ideal self would be coming from our own national culture.
Kind of along those lines, we had another person ask about if you work for an organization whose values might be fundamentally different than yours. Not to say that you and the organization are completely on different sides of the ethical map, but if they value one set of core competencies, or if there's something that you think is just a misalignment there, how do you function within that organization, and how do you make sure that you find your values within their values?
I think there's something very insightful in the way that the question was posed. The first part of my answer is actually it's quite potentially alienating to be out of alignment with the values in your organization. This is another part of the research that we've done, but we actually find that one's own personal values coming from the values hierarchy really predict whether you feel fit in the organization you're part of. And if you feel that fit, you're more motivated, you're more likely to stay on the job, you're a better collaborator, you contribute more to the organization. So the fit really matters. And if it's not there, you're in a disadvantaged position. But as the question suggests, we've also found that if you have to be part of an organization where you don't have a natural fit with your values, the way to do it is really to look for ways to represent your values within theirs, right? So we have some exercises, for example, where you try and empathize with the appropriateness of the organization's values for what the organization is trying to do. You try and explain what you're being asked to do by the organization in terms of your own values. And if you can do that kind of negotiation, coming to terms between the values of the people you're working with and your own, we find that that provides a notable increase in job satisfaction and fit. So the answer really is, I think it's ideal if you do feel that correspondence of values of the people around you. If you don't have it, search for it by trying to justify what they do in terms of your values and understand their values in their context.
Kind of along those lines, we've had a few people ask questions about differences in personal values or professional values, and where the values themselves, the things that you value, might change slightly depending on your setting.
Yeah.
Is there some guidance or some way for them to think about it? Should they treat it all as sort of like one core set of values, or should there be flexibility?
Yeah, I've got some guidance,
Okay.
and there are things that we haven't completely resolved with the scientific analysis, but I've certainly thought about those, and I think they're really important questions. So when we create the values hierarchies, we do them in the context of work. So we ask people to think about what's important to them at work. But our experience is usually people can take the product of that exercise, take their hierarchy, and apply it outside of work. So we have people who use it to improve important personal relationships, things that are nothing to do with work. Um, so mostly I would say that almost everyone who produces the hierarchy in the context of work can apply it outside work. Leads me to think that we're really tapping in to a kind of generalizable set of values, as I think we would, because values are really helping us connect to our ideals. The second question was, part of the question was, how do values evolve? Our answer so far is slowly. We find we've gone back to the subjects of our research after about 2 years, and we find that they are still very enthusiastic about the values hierarchy they created 2 years earlier. We'll have to wait more time so we can learn about the longer term changes. At the same time, I think that there are evolution in values, and that people may kind of put different points of emphasis in values. And I've also been told by the coach, who was really the kind of inspiration for me for starting this research program, that in his lifetime of working with values, he's found that if people experience a really unusual shock to their life, not the kind of everyday hurdles that we run into, but a really kind of rare and negative event, that it could result in a change in their values.
I think we have time for just one more question. So I'm going to go ahead and ask this one because it's come up from a few people. Once you've tapped into your values, once you kind of know what you stand for, how do you communicate that? I know a lot of people are saying, all right, so I know who I am and I know who I want to be, but I have trouble articulating that. I have trouble conveying that in my day-to-day and work. Are there some things that people can do to make them better at appearing as authentic as they are?
Yeah, I think that there almost certainly are. And let me say that people may wonder that question, but you may be doing a better job than you think you are about expressing yourself if you are tapped into your values. Because as I say, the people in our experiment, the values condition, didn't talk explicitly about values. They didn't even talk as much about themselves, but yet they were viewed as representing their ideal selves and being authentic. But there's lots of other reasons why communicating your values is important. We find that, for example, it really helps people connect in terms of relationships. And for that, we've got a couple of mechanisms. With the people who've created the values hierarchies, we have them share and talk through their hierarchies, and that helps them overcome differences in their values. To use that to the kind of broader population, the people who aren't walking around with these concrete representations of their values, I like to recommend that you think about formative stories in your life. They're really kind of important moments that you think of as having made you what you are. I think those stories are usually important for us because actually they're representing our values. And the advantage of explaining your values in a story is it gives it credibility. If I was to say, I value trust, you could respond, well, it's easy to say, how do I know he really values trust? But if I tell you a story about a betrayal and how hurt I was by that and how it affected my life, then I think there's something credible and substantial behind my claim that trust is a value. So I would think, reflect on the stories of your life and the formative moments and find appropriate ways to tell those stories to the people you interact with. They're going to like to hear the stories, and it's a window into your true self.
That's great. Well, I think that's just about all the time we have. So I want to say thank you to everyone who attended. Again, as a reminder, we will have the recording available for you in just a few business days, so keep an eye out for that. And we promise to do our best to get Professor Ingram back in here and do another one of these webinars very soon. So Paul, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to everybody.
Have a great day.